One of the core things that is immediately confusing to people is what to test, or more specifically, the jargon that surrounds the whole testing ecosystem. So for example, we have unit testing. What does that refer to? Does that refer to testing one class in isolation? Or does that mean a collection of related classes? Well, you know what? People kind of disagree on this. But then you hear about other things like integration testing, or functional testing, or acceptance testing. Or then there's all of these different terms throughout the various language communities that refer to mostly the same thing, like system testing, end-to-end testing, user testing, Selenium testing. Many of these refer to the exact same thing, but all of the communities have labeled them a bit differently. So when you're first getting started, at least in my case, this was incredibly overwhelming. I would just want to start out by testing a CRUD app. How do you make sure that you create, read, update, and delete? How do you test that? And the problem is there isn't that much education. Would a CRUD app fall under unit testing? Would it be a functional test? Well, what I didn't understand is it's not one size fits all. For a particular project, you don't pick unit testing and that's all you do. Testing has many layers. So maybe you'll start out with an acceptance test. And this refers to, think of this as the overall feature or the client's request. I want a login system so I can view protected data. That would be a basic acceptance test. And that will give you a bird's eye view of how to know when your feature has been implemented. When that test returns green, that feature is ready to go. However, you can't stick with acceptance tests because if something fails, well, you're not really going to know specifically what does fail. You're just going to know, at some point in the life cycle of this feature, something went wrong. And that's why we back up our acceptance tests with unit, integration, or functional. That way we have a very low level. For each class, we have a unit test that ensures that it works basically as we expect it to. That way, if anything goes wrong on that level, we'll know immediately on the unit testing level what went wrong, rather than having to debug an acceptance test and try to find where some issue might be. An integration test is generally how two different parts of your application integrate. So for example, you could write an integration test for maybe an Eloquent model if you're a Laravel user. That way you can ensure when you call this method, the correct SQL query will be executed against the database or a database in memory, which we'll go over soon. And then we have functional tests, and in many ways, these are very similar to acceptance tests. And once again, in some communities, they would say those are the exact same thing. If you ever read a tutorial and somebody says, we'll write a functional/acceptance test, that's their way of saying, I think these are the same thing. Now, I don't quite. I view a bit of a difference. I view the acceptance test as your customer or the client's request. They will determine whether your feature has been implemented. And that means your functional tests, which I think of as, once again, outside in, but from the developer's point of view, what you think needs to have happen. So you could pass your functional test, then give it back to the client and they could go, oh no, this didn't behave exactly like I expected. And usually what this means is the acceptance test was wrong. The client didn't express exactly what they needed to well enough. So even though all of your unit, integration, and functional tests are passing, you could still fail the acceptance test. And then we have all of these others, and they kind of refer to the same thing. User testing, testing from the point of view of the user. Selenium, well, this is a tool for testing the UI and any JavaScript that goes along with it. So you could include that as part of acceptance testing. And in fact, you could write an acceptance test using Selenium. So my recommendation to you is, if this is overwhelming to you the way it was for me, cut out all of them. Just stick with a couple things. If you're new to testing, start with basic unit testing. Test a calculator, test operations. Then once you have that under your belt, write some acceptance tests. This is the best way to get into it because in many ways we already do acceptance testing just manually. When we go to the browser, we fill in that login form and we are redirected to the admin page. That's sort of a manual acceptance test. We just want to translate that so that it can be automated and triggered whenever we need it to. So if you only stuck with these 3 or 4, you'd be in good shape. Don't feel like you need to learn everything. Just pick one, stick with that, and then keep going until you realize a need for a second. So you'll write your acceptance tests, and then eventually you'll realize, when this does fail, it's very difficult for me to pinpoint where the error was. So maybe I need some lower level integration or unit tests to back up this acceptance test. That's the way it works. But mostly all of this jargon is just a big mess in the testing world. Pick a few, and that'll take you a long ways.